In the sweltering summer of 1982, Hong Kong was a city that never truly slept. Neon lights bathed the crowded streets, and taxis roamed the night, carrying strangers from one corner of the city to another. For most, these taxis were a symbol of convenience and safety, an everyday lifeline in one of the busiest cities in the world. But for a few unlucky women who stepped into one particular cab, that ride would be their last. It began like any other night. A woman hailing a taxi, a driver pulling over with a polite nod, the car door shutting with a familiar click. Nothing about the driver seemed unusual. He was quiet, unremarkable, almost forgettable. Yet beneath that ordinary facade lurked a darkness so disturbing that Hong Kong would later brand him with a chilling name, the Taxi Monster. His real name was Lam Kor-wan. Outwardly, he was just another young man trying to make a living, driving a taxi through the city's sleepless hours. But inside, he carried urges that defied comprehension, urges that would drive him to commit some of the most grotesque crimes in Hong Kong's history. The story that follows is not for the faint of heart. It is a descent into obsession, secrecy, and horror, a case that revealed how a quiet man behind the wheel of a taxi became one of Asia's most infamous killers. To understand how Lam Kor-wan became one of Hong Kong's most notorious criminals, we need to look back at both the city he lived in and the life he led before his descent into violence. Hong Kong in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a place of extremes. It was booming with rapid modernization, high-rise apartments stretching skyward, and neon signs painting the skyline in every color. Yet beneath the glittering lights was a city grappling with overcrowding, rising crime, and a growing sense of unease. It was a time when the gap between the ordinary struggles of daily life and the hidden undercurrents of danger felt razor thin. Amid this backdrop lived Lam Kor-wan. Born in 1955, he grew up in a working-class family, one of several siblings in a crowded household. Those who knew him described him as quiet, polite, and largely unremarkable, someone who blended into the background. There was nothing outwardly menacing about him. In fact, neighbors and relatives saw him as almost painfully ordinary, the kind of young man you would never remember after a brief encounter. As he entered adulthood, Lam seemed to drift. He tried different jobs before eventually becoming a taxi driver, working the night shift. Driving a cab provided him anonymity and independence. He could slip in and out of the city's rhythms without drawing attention. But it also gave him something else: unsupervised control over strangers in the dead of night. Behind closed doors, however, Lam's private life hinted at something far darker. He developed a fascination with photography, spending hours studying and experimenting with film cameras. To others, it looked like a harmless hobby, but for Lam, the camera would later become the tool that documented his darkest impulses. Combined with his growing sexual obsessions and a disturbing attraction to death, his quiet demeanor masked a secret world of fantasies that were spiraling out of control. On the surface, Lam was just another face in the crowd of Hong Kong's millions, but beneath that normal exterior, the seeds of something monstrous were already taking root, seeds that would soon erupt into violence in ways that shocked the entire city. The first known signs of Lam Kor-wan's transformation from quiet cab driver to killer came in the early months of 1982. By this time, his fantasies had been brewing for years, festering in silence. Driving a taxi at night gave him the opportunity to act on them. The passengers who stepped into his cab had no idea they were entering a trap from which they would never return. His first victim was a young woman he picked up late at night. The details of that encounter would only emerge later through police investigation and Lam's own chilling confessions. Once she was inside the cab, Lam strangled her to death. Quick, silent, and merciless. He then drove her lifeless body back to his apartment, while the rest of the city carried on unaware. Inside his home, Lam's obsession took on its most terrifying form. He undressed the body, posed it, and photographed it meticulously with his camera, capturing the images he would later keep like trophies. But it didn't stop there. He began to dismember the corpse, cutting it into pieces with a precision that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The remains were stored in plastic containers, some even refrigerated, as if they were objects rather than parts of a once living woman. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It was methodical, deliberate, and fueled by a twisted fascination with death and control. For Lam, it was not enough to kill. He wanted to possess, document, and relive the act through his photographs. What made the horror even chilling was that no one suspected anything. Lam returned to work as if nothing had happened, quietly picking up new fares, blending into the flow of city life. But inside, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The killing had awakened something in him, and soon he would strike again. Once Lam Kor-wan committed his first murder, it seemed to unleash something inside him. What had started as a secret fantasy turned into a compulsion. In the span of just a few months in 1982, Lam killed again and again, targeting young women who, like his first victim, simply needed a ride home. The pattern was chillingly consistent. He worked the night shift, prowling the streets until he spotted a lone female passenger. After luring her into his taxi, he would strangle her, often using electrical wire or cords he kept prepared in the cab. The murders were swift and silent, executed with disturbing efficiency. From there, the routine became grotesquely familiar. Lam transported the bodies back to his small apartment, where his rituals unfolded behind closed doors. Each victim was subjected to the same horrifying fate: posed, photographed, and eventually dismembered. Lam treated the process with a detached precision, as though he were carrying out an experiment rather than committing murder. Over time, he grew bolder. He carefully stored body parts in plastic containers, sometimes refrigerating them, while keeping hundreds of photographs as mementos. The images captured not just the victim's final moments, but also the twisted satisfaction of the man behind the camera. By the summer of 1982, at least 4 women had vanished after hailing a taxi at night. Families filed missing persons reports, but in a city as crowded and chaotic as Hong Kong, disappearances were not always immediately connected. To the outside world, the cases looked isolated, even random, but in truth, they were linked by one man who carried out his gruesome crimes in the shadows of an ordinary profession. The city remained oblivious, its neon lights burning bright, while a serial killer hunted undetected among them. Lam's double life, quiet driver by day, monstrous predator by night, continued to escalate. And with each crime, his secret collection of photographs and body parts grew larger, evidence of a horror that had not yet been uncovered. For months, Lam Kor-wan's crimes went unnoticed. Missing persons cases piled up in police files, but there was no clear link between the women who had vanished. In a city of millions, where people sometimes disappeared without explanation, the pattern was almost impossible to see. The truth is, if not for one small mistake, Lam might have continued his killing spree much longer. That mistake came from his obsession with documenting everything he did. Lam was meticulous about his photography. He shot hundreds of images of his victims, carefully developing some while keeping the negatives of others. To him, these photographs were trophies, proof that he had complete control over his victims even in death. But his need to preserve his crimes became the very thing that exposed him. In August 1982, Lam took a roll of film to a local photo shop for development. The images that came back were unlike anything the shop's employees had ever seen. They showed mutilated female bodies, posed, dissected, and captured with chilling clarity. At first, the staff thought it might be some kind of grotesque art project, but as the reality set in, they realized they were looking at evidence of murder. The police were called immediately. Within hours, detectives were examining the photographs, horrified by what they revealed. The level of detail left little doubt. The killer was methodical, organized, and operating right under the city's nose. Tracing the film back to its owner was not difficult. The records pointed to one man, a 27-year-old taxi driver named Lam Kor-wan. When officers arrived at his home, what they found exceeded even their darkest expectations. Lam's apartment had been turned into a macabre laboratory. There were plastic containers holding preserved body parts, a refrigerator storing pieces of human flesh, and stacks of photographs cataloging his crimes. Investigators later counted more than 400 images, each one documenting Lam's ritualistic obsession. Alongside them were notebooks in which he had recorded his thoughts, as though he were writing a manual of his own depravity. The discovery left police officers shaken. Many of them had seen violent crime before, but nothing on this scale of cruelty and precision. They knew immediately they were dealing with one of Hong Kong's most dangerous killers. And now, with the evidence laid bare, Lam's carefully concealed double life had finally unraveled. When police arrested Lam Kor-wan in August 1982, he did not resist. The quiet taxi driver who had terrified the city from the shadows seemed almost calm, even detached, as officers escorted him away from his apartment filled with grotesque evidence. For investigators, the overwhelming amount of proof, body parts, photographs, tools, and notebooks left little room for doubt, but they still needed to hear it from him. During interrogation, Lam was described as unnervingly composed. He spoke of his crimes without anger or remorse, detailing how he had lured women into his taxi, strangled them, and taken their bodies home. His fascination with photography and his meticulous record-keeping became central to the case. The photographs served not only as evidence, but as a chilling window into his state of mind, a man who treated human life as material for his private experiments. The trial that followed in 1983 became one of Hong Kong's most infamous court cases. The public was horrified as details emerged: the preserved remains found in his apartment, the hundreds of photographs, the cold precision with which he had carried out his killings. Newspapers dubbed him the taxi monster, and his face became synonymous with the darkest side of the city's underworld. Lam was charged with multiple counts of murder. The prosecution presented the photographs, the forensic evidence, and Lam's own confessions. His defense attempted to argue diminished responsibility, pointing to psychological instability, but the scale and clarity of his crimes left the jury unconvinced. The verdict was swift. Lam Kor-wan was found guilty of murder. Initially, he was sentenced to death. However, as Hong Kong moved away from carrying out executions, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. To this day, Lam remains behind bars, serving out his sentence as one of the most notorious inmates in the territory's history. The arrest of Lam Kor-wan shocked Hong Kong to its core. For months, women had disappeared into the night, and no one imagined the killer was a quiet taxi driver blending seamlessly into everyday life. His crimes left scars, not only on the families of the victims, but also on the city's collective sense of safety. Taxis, once a symbol of convenience, suddenly felt dangerous, especially for women traveling alone. In the years that followed, the case remained one of the darkest chapters in Hong Kong's criminal history. It raised urgent conversations about mental health, safety in public transport, and the terrifying reality that evil can hide in the most ordinary places.